Thank you so much, Chris. Again, everyone, please do feel free to get in touch with Chris through one of the various methods that she identified. If you do have any technical support, we want this to be as smooth a process for you as possible, and we really think that you'll get a lot out of it, so we don't want technical issues to stand in your way. So again, our presenter today is Dr. Ernestine Hector-Mason from American Institutes for Research. She's going to be talking to us about evidence-based instruction, and I will turn it over to her now. Ernestine? Ernestine, are you there? Oh dear.
Yes.
Okay, there you are. Great. Thanks, Ernestine.
About that, apparently my off. Hello, everyone. Hello again. Thanks for joining today. Someone seems to be typing, so can you mute your microphone, please? As is noted on the screen, our discussion today is about evidence-based instruction. My name, as you see, is Ernestine Hector-Mason. I'm a researcher at the American Institutes for Research. Before we begin, let's talk about some general administrative matters regarding question and answers for this webinar. If you have any questions while I'm speaking, please feel just know that I will be offering some time and some breaks in between, some 30-second and 1-minute breaks in between for you to post your questions. So just know that your questions will be answered. Before we begin our speaking about evidence-based instruction, do you have any questions for me before we start? Type it in the general chat area if you do. Okay. Oh, thank you. I would like to go over an overview of some basic concepts. Well, it's a basic overview of the presentation. These are just some introductory, there will be some introductory concepts that I will be sharing with you today regarding evidence-based instruction. I will provide you with some prevailing definitions and some of my own concerns and some other concerns that I've seen in the literature regarding what is considered evidence-based instruction. And I will not focus on what the concerns are, but I will just sort of just give you just a small briefing on what some of the concerns are. We will touch on some really general literature that informed evidence-based instruction. We will look at some of the research based in adult education, including some produced by CALPRO. There are some subject area examples of evidence-based instruction in adult education. And then we will look overall at evidence-based instruction and teacher effectiveness. Before I move on to begin, if you do have questions at this point, can you write them down, please? You can take 30 seconds to write any questions that you have about evidence-based instruction, any questions that you will hope to have answered by the end of this session. Please post them. Okay. It seems like no one has any questions. Okay. So let's look at the introductory concepts. One thing I think is very important to know about evidence-based instruction is that it didn't come out of nowhere. There is a historical basis for evidence-based instruction. There's a legal basis for evidence-based instruction, and there is also a practical basis for evidence-based instruction. And that is some of what I will be talking with you about today. In many ways, the historical and legal bases are intertwined, and you will see that. With history and experience, of course, comes legislation, as you know. All of these bases were informed by, of course, the conditions of education in the United States, and the fact that schools were not producing the quality of students that legislators expected. to advance the workforce in the United States. Before we get into this, though, let me say that the literature shows that the notion of evidence-based instruction is derived primarily from the medical field and particularly from healthcare, which has utilized this approach, the strategy for promoting health care for decades, if not millennia. So this is a brief summary of the history and legislation. I think for the most part, many of you might have to do some of your own searches, because there may not be enough time to cover much of this. But this is the sort of brief history that informed what we are calling today evidence-based instruction. With regards to education, the idea of evidence-based education and instruction was inspired by several legislations and national initiatives. And the most recent, you might be familiar with, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, I believe. And this was a derivative of older legislation, starting with the Elementary and Secondary School Education Act of 1965, and with Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. The idea was that there was a need to focus on disadvantaged children, disadvantaged populations, impoverished areas, and children who came out of those, out of poverty. And so there was some federal funding for poor schools with low achieving students, and I think that was called Title I, which was aimed at primarily improving the education, initially improving the education of disadvantaged children. And then in 1983, there became, this report called A Nation at Risk, and the focus in education changed, essentially looking at more standardized testing as a way of determining students' need and the idea of reform on education and standardized testing took precedence. And in 1994, the focus became on content and performance standards. There was the reauthorization of the 1965 law again, and with that came some new expectations to improve America's school. You may remember the Improving America's School Act of 1994, IASA, which required all states to have content and performance standards. And then in 2001, we had NCLB, where there would, focus on achievement testing and accountability. There were dramatic changes to the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Sorry. And it marked greater power and assessment. The focus became on, assessment and accountability. And NCLB brought considerable clarity to the value, use, and importance of achievement testing of students in the kindergarten through high schools. A lot of the funding for education was tied to accountability expectations. Schools needed to ensure that all students learned, so the focus, turned from only disadvantaged students to all students needing to learn. Schools, being accountable for student learning. And school data, for example, had to show not only school effectiveness, but also student learning. Now, the way in which we look at evidence-based instruction today, or the practical basis of evidence-based instruction, is informed by this history and also by the legislation or laws that govern the conduct of education in the United States. So that's really important to consider. Are there any questions so far? Now, let's look at some prevailing definitions. So from these histories, we have, No Child Left Behind. We have, this greater focus on accountability. there are some new ideas and new definitions. I mean, in fact, NCLB has a very specific definition of what evidence entails. Um, let's now look at some prevailing definitions to get a better sense of what is meant by evidence-based instruction. What really is the thing we call evidence-based instruction, and what are some key constructs to consider to understand what is being referred to here. Now, it is important to note that as with any other definition, the definition of evidence-based instruction is not without concerns, and this goes back to what I started off talking about. Of course, I will not venture into a discussion of the concerns here today, but I think it is important to share with you that there are prevailing debates within the research community about what is or what does and doesn't count as research. And I believe that these debates are part of an even larger discussion related to the issue of different preferences, I should say, for different research paradigms. Like two prevailing paradigms, for example, are the quantitative paradigm, which comes from the more positivist um, uh, viewpoint about reality and assessing reality, and there is also the qualitative perspective. There are contending arguments in the field regarding which side produces the best evidence, and in the field of education, for example, there is an appearance that there is a preference for more quantitative approaches, even though all researchers will many researchers, I should say, would argue that there are value in all of the different approaches. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. So let's look at a general definition starting in 1992 with, excuse me for 1 second, please. Starting in 1992, as is noted, all of the history and legislative actions led to important educational change and reform, including what I alluded to on a previous slide about the practical basis for evidence-based instruction. In order to implement instruction that is based on evidence, one needs to be able to define the action word in the phrase evidence-based, and that is evidence. And there also needs to be some consensus and such definition. So understanding evidence is not sufficient. Getting a clearer sense on whether or not there is consensus regarding what counts as evidence is also important to consider. So now let's consider the definition of evidence-based education as a general umbrella for all aspects of education that can involve evidence, such as instruction, like evidence-based instruction, programming, evidence-based programming, and so forth. And as we get closer to the end of the presentation, I will show you what I mean by these different points I just made here. I believe that it is important, I believe that it is from a more general look at the concept of evidence-based education that one could begin to examine the idea of evidence-based instruction. So see, there's a difference here. Education is the broader umbrella, and there is instruction. Because instruction is only one part of education. One definition of evidence-based education comes from the U.S. Department of Education in 2002 through a presentation by the then Secretary.
Anderson, I think we lost you a second. Anderson, okay, it looks like she got kicked out of the room, so she should be back with us shortly. I apologize for that, and I ask that you just give us a couple of minutes. Sorry about the inconvenience.
Welcome back, Ernestine. You might want to take a moment to reconfigure your microphone, and then we'll get resuming again. That's the audio setup wizard.
And while we're waiting, and this might be a good opportunity if you've come up with any questions while Anastasia been talking so far, or if there's anything you've always wanted to have somebody who is an expert on this topic at your disposal ready to answer, please feel free to put those into the chat pod, and we'll try to address all of those for you here today.
Hello.
Hey, Ernestine, glad you're back.
Hi, how are you? I'm so sorry. I have no idea what happened.
It looks like a number of people got kind of dropped or kicked out of the room, so you weren't alone. So you guys did it right. You just came right back, and we let you right back in. So great job, everybody.
Okay. Thank you. So I think I was saying that the definition, and again, this is one definition, but it focuses on the integration of both professional wisdom and empirical evidence. And there is a whole story about what constitutes empirical evidence, or what constitutes the evidence in evidence-based instruction. So this general definition, as I said, came from Grover Whitehouse, who was the Assistant Secretary of Education. The department defined education, or evidence-based education, as professional wisdom which involves both individual experience and consensus, as well as empirical evidence, which involves scientifically based research and empirical information. This is actually a picture of that Grover Whitehouse's presentation in 2002. And, you know, as is shown here, in accordance with the definition I just noted, note that there are these two major prongs of evidence-based instruction, each of which have two additional major prongs. And there is a dialogic relationship, or there is, the expectation is that there would be this dialogue between the idea of professional wisdom and empirical evidence. In essence, from that 2002 idea, evidence-based education, it's really an assimilation or an incorporation of these two key ideas, these two key prongs that I'm showing here. So the model doesn't reflect a one or the other approach. When one thinks about evidence-based instruction, they shouldn't think about one or the other, either professional wisdom or empirical evidence, but clearly one and the other. And in addition, NCLB defined what is considered scientifically based research. If you look on the evidence, the empirical evidence side of this two-prong model, at the bottom there is scientifically based research. NCLB has a very specific definition for what that entails. And I will show you what that is now. So according to NCLB, scientifically based research, which is a part of this whole definition of evidence-based research, is research that involves the application of rigorous, systematic, and objective procedures to obtain reliable and valid knowledge relevant to education, activities, and programs. Now, the expectation is that this is the type of research that must be used to inform educational practice. And now let's look closely at how this idea is operationalized within the context of evidence-based instruction. So this is all about evidence-based education. Now let's look at what it means within the context of evidence-based instruction. And the International Reading Association in 2002 launched this definition, which sort of reflects the NCLB definition somewhat. But this is one of the prevailing definitions that is used a lot, not only in the K-12 arena, but also in adult education. And when we start talking about the STAR program, I will come back to that, because I think much of the data or the findings from this work help to inform the 4 major components of reading which we are using today in adult education. So I'll talk about that in a little while. But according to the International Reading Association, evidence-based instruction is a program or instructional practice that is derived from rigorous research and has demonstrated a record of success. So evidence in this sense is considered to be reliable and trustworthy, or reliable and trustworthy indicators of effectiveness. And there are debates about how to assess instruction that's reliable, or how to assess instruction that is effective, which method or which methodology is best. You know, these have been just some concerns in the field. The IRA identified the following 5 key components of evidence, and one is the evidence must be objective. That means that data that any evaluator would identify and interpret similarly. So different educators can look at the same information, and the interpretation has to be similar. So that would be the indicator of objective, an objective evidence. That's the objective component. It must also be valid. So data that adequately represents the task that children need to accomplish, or adults, to be successful readers. So it must be valid. It must adequately represent the task. If we're talking about a specific reading task, for example, the information must be adequately represented or reflective of that particular task. It also must be reliable. The data will remain essentially unchanged. If collected on a different day or different time by a different person, it should be the same. No matter what day you look at it, you should be able to find the same information. That suggests that the data are reliable. It must be systematic, so it can't be a willy-nilly collection of information, and it has to be a systematic collection, and accordingly it has to involve some sort of rigorous design of either experimentation or observation. And then the final thing, it must be referred, it must be approved by someone above whoever the initial reviewers or the initial, I guess, data collectors and analysts are. Okay. As I alluded to earlier, determinations about what counts as evidence can be very murky at times, given the various range of research approaches that can generate evidence, including, and also there are disputes within the scientific field about what is and isn't evidence, and which research approach provides the best indication of evidence. Nonetheless, what I think is important to take away here is that the meaning of the expression evidence-based instruction appears very clear when, within these murky waters here. It is, you can think of it as instructional approaches, practices, or methodologies that are produced from evidence. I mean, that's one of the simplest definitions. Anything used in the classroom that is derived from evidence, right? And it's a derivative, if we were to use some of the NCLB, thinking about this, it's a derivative of empirical research or scientifically rigorous research. Okay. So now let's let's look at well, let me get some questions from you first before I move on. Are there any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions here. So let's look at another. Just look at that. Now, one thing that one must remember when thinking about evidence-based instruction is that many of the efforts regarding evidence-based instruction and what counts as evidence is derived and shaped by and in many ways reflected by the K-12 research effort and research agenda. That's what I found from reviewing the literature. There is a high K-12 influence on a lot of the knowledge that is that is produced in education, and sometimes when it gets to adult education, it is formed by K-12 initial efforts to identify evidence of good practices. So this is something. But overall, I would say that there have been some definitive shifts in adult education over the last decade, and I will be sharing some of that with you today. There are some very definitive and very compelling shifts by the U.S. Department of Education to ensure that there is information that is derived from rigorous efforts to support adult education and to support teaching and learning within the adult education context. And let's look at some of what these shifts have been, a sample of what these are. And I think we already know, as I said, that much of the K-12 literature helped to shape some of the meanings that we produce in adult education. There have been some considerable shifts, as I mentioned, and there have been some real large-scale efforts by OCTAE, including the following. Adult Education, the Teacher Effectiveness Project, which is currently in effect, I believe started in 2010. That's one example. Teal, Teaching Excellence in Adult Education is another. There is also STAR, Student Achievement in Reading, Adult Numeracy Initiative in 2007. And I will be going through each of these separately. And if you have any questions regarding them, just either raise your hand or write the question down. So let's look at the Teacher Effectiveness Project, which started in 2002. Under the Adult Education Teacher Effectiveness Project, the environmental scan, which was a really major task on that project, helped to inform much of the other products that were developed from that on that project. Now, when you look at an environmental scan, it involves very, very rigorous data analysis efforts. It involves a rigorous data collection effort. Sometimes it involves literature reviews. It involves interviewing people, studying, document reviews. I mean, anything you can think of that one can review and analyze. Sometimes they are involved in environmental scan. And this environmental scan in particular focused on teacher professional development. And the information that was derived from this work helped to inform the development of an adult education teacher induction toolkit, adult education teacher competencies, and adult education teacher induction model. Now, what makes this work that was done here different from the scientifically based research that is referred to in LCMB is that this model here utilized more of a qualitative type of approach, a qualitative methodology to identify meaning that would be relevant to the adult education context. So some people who are probably from more quantitative perspective or prefer to use more quantitative approaches might be able to conduct an environmental scan that involves more quantitative approaches, but this one in particular looked at qualitative research, and so it wasn't like a randomized control trial or any such rigorous activity, but it did involve a lot of rigor in terms of the methodology and also in terms of the analytical procedures that were applied to the information that were collected. Okay, so this environmental scan examined the landscape of knowledge on teacher effectiveness, and of course the largest body of knowledge in that document came from the K-12 arena. And as I said, these are the other documents or products that were developed from this effort. And you know, I'm saying all of this to say that qualitative researchers may say this is, you know, rigorous and you know, and based in real deep, you know, analytical rigor, and quantitative people may say, oh, this is, you know, this is not scientifically based research. But in essence, what this scan did was identify scientifically based research and analyze scientifically based research. Although much of that came from the K-12 arena. Now, there is also the Teal Project, the evidence-based writing instruction. It includes or involves research-based interventions in the sense that Teal examines research-based interventions in writing. And based on all of that information that was, you know, all of the information that was studied for the Teal Project, they came up with the definition that writing is a language-based process that includes oral language, reading, and writing. It's a complex social and cognitive process. It's a process that carries a very significant affective and emotional element that affects learners' motivation and engagement. And what that means is that, you know, it involves, you know, writing comes from inside, and if you know, these, I guess, statements here have implications for how to teach writing. If it carries a significant affective or emotional element that affects learners' motivation and engagement, and all of this is derived from research. What it suggests is that teachers have to change their approach so that they don't have any negative effects on writers, and that can, you know, have implications for whether or not you use a red ink pen or a green. It could have implications for how many comments do you make on a writer's paper, or you know, what kind of feedback you know, you provide to students. So there are, on the Teal Project, and I have links here as well as at the end of this webinar, there are several links that you can review to look at what these, you know, what the Teal project entails, and some examples of what evidence-based writing instruction involves. There are some other areas of focus on that project as well. Teal focuses on strategy, what they call strategy instruction, self-regulated learning, universal design for learning, formative assessment, differentiated instruction, and effective lesson planning, all of which are presented, or many of which are presented in some research briefs. And it all includes research-based intervention about what are best practices in teaching, writing in particular. Any questions so far?
Yes, we received a question that asks, did you say that EBE needs to reflect the California ESL standards?
I'm sorry?
The question that was put in the chat pod, Giuseppe, it asked, would you say that EBE, or evidence-based, EBI, needs to reflect the California ESL standards?
I mean, it depends on how it is defined. It depends on how, I think there has to be consensus in the definition, as I said. I think many of the practices need to involve some level of evidence, but I think evidence changes over time. I think what is considered evidence today that works in a particular classroom may not be evidence in some years. I think what we call evidence has to change with the times. Evidence that was relevant, and this is particular within the human and social science research. Now, in medical research, there might be evidence that would last a lifetime. There might, cutting your nails or some medicines, taking an aspirin might help someone in the 1800s, might have helped someone in the 1800s, and it still helps someone today. But I think with our changing culture and changing society, I don't think that evidence is always deterministic. I don't think that it is something that is unchangeable. I mean, consider that our classrooms are changing. Consider that when the researcher goes into the classroom to collect data, writes the reports, for a study like a randomized controlled trial, a report might come out in 5 years. That's after the whole system, had changed. So, and then there is the other issue of context. Would research conducted in one context be relevant in another? Is another important question that is part of the concerns that people have about this whole definition of evidence-based instruction. So I think it is relevant when there is complete parity between what was studied and where it is implemented. But I think oftentimes there might be some difficulties because of the changing nature of the student population in the classroom. So that's one issue. And so all of that to say that regarding the California ELL standards, I think it is important to find evidence that perhaps is constant, that that is transferred from context to context or from period to period. And so I'm saying yes, but I think there will definitely be a need for strong professional judgment to determine what that evidence should be, and there should be consensus in determining what works, and there should be continued monitoring of the implementation of anything that is considered evidence over time to ensure that it still stands the test of time. Does that answer the question?
It looks like it did.
Okay, thank you. I think part of the issue, and I wouldn't say it's a problem, it's just a debate between different fields about what, different departments and different fields about really, because what we really are talking about here is how do you assess knowledge? How do you assess reality? How do you assess something? Because we all know that, especially in the United States, where, students from not only of different levels, different educational background, and particularly in the adult education system, you have multi-level students, different backgrounds, different languages, different experiences with schooling, different experiences with the alphabet, different experiences with language. Some come from oral communities, others come from, more literate communities, and so the experiences there are so fundamentally different from some other contexts that, what might count as evidence in one context may not be transferable to, another context, and that's why it is important for programs to really utilize professional judgment, but also add onto that just be in a constant state, I would say, of monitoring any implementation. So this way you are in charge of the evidence that you gather. If you follow some of the basic principles that I had talked about earlier from the International Reading Association, I think that's might be a really good model you might want to follow in terms of monitoring for yourself what is working and what are successful practices and what might not work for the students. And this has to happen, over time, because I imagine in adult education there are students, every year it might be a different, composition of students. And now let's look at EBE, evidence-based reading instruction. And STAR is one of those hallmark projects or programs that focus on reading achievement in adult education. before these works, there were two other efforts in adult education, one of which was derived from what is known as the Krudner report. So before the previous works that I mentioned, there was the Krudner report of 2002. I remember in the early, around that time, there was just a lot of conversation about the four components of reading: alphabetics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. Um, but STAR, these four major components, if you look at some of the work that came out from the International Reading Association, you will see that they had the same findings around the same time. So I didn't, I don't feel like I spent sufficient time looking closely at the Krudner findings in relationship to the IRA's findings, but the outcomes are well, not the outcomes, but the four components are also included in the IRA's work. And I believe the IRA came out a year before, so it's very possible that Krudner might have tested the findings from the IRA with adults. I believe that that's what that study was about. But these are the four major components, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with STAR and the STAR toolkit. When taught systematically, the belief is regarding STAR and explicitly, these areas were found to advance student development. So given its research basis, it could be a good tool for supporting reading instruction in adult education classes. And I say this because I think, as I said before, that meaning changes over time. Nothing is constant. And in a place like the United States, a place we should be calling the United Nations, because there are so many people from so many different backgrounds, I know that much of what we take for granted today, in the next 10 years or so, there will need to be another look at something else, because the classrooms do not remain constant. And that's a really important issue. And then there's the Adult Numeracy Initiative, and that was a work that was informed by the National Math Advisory Panel of 2007, and they produced a report in 2008 called Foundations for Success in Mathematics. And I believe that work was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education. There is also a review of literature that came after that, and on a project that AIR was awarded by the U.S. Department of Education called the Adult Numeracy Initiative, and that project identified the research on and the conceptual issues undergirding adult numeracy, because the idea of numeracy was not new, but ignored really in the U.S. There was a lot of international information that informed that literature review. And of course, we did an environmental scan that involved not only a review of literature, but also a review of documents and interview with some of the key adult numeracy experts or practitioners in the U.S. And that included many of the people from the Adult Numeracy Network, as well as math, or anyone involved in math. We interviewed teachers, program directors to, gain a sense of how to define, mathematical thinking in the United States, given the limits that we were dealing with, and that limits involved just a complete lack of literature on the topic. And then there is also the strengthening math skills in post-secondary level. There is another literature review and analysis. So there was some considerable work that the U.S. Department of Education, then the Office of Vocational and Adult Education, it was called OVE then, I think it's OCTE now, but there was some considerable work that was done in numeracy. And it seems like there's the need for a lot more over the world. There are all these math eyes, conferences that are going around, because there's this whole idea that mathematics is in everything. And this is not only true, but it's there's a lot of research in other countries, in the UK and New Zealand and Australia, that really links and ties mathematics to literacy. In the U.S., what we call mathematical literacy is what's called numeracy in these other countries, but really we are looking at some of the same things, and the only difference is in the U.S. we have done more, as you can see here, literature review, reports. We haven't done much of the scientific research that probably folks from NCLB might be interested in. So, adult education is in a state of development, and there's a lot of work that has to be done to really inform practices. But I do think that what I've mentioned so far, STAR and the Teacher Effectiveness Project and this Adult Numeracy Initiative are just some examples of, of just the hard work that the team at the Department of Education are involved in to ensure that there is meaning that is provided to adult educators that's really grounded in real day-to-day adult education practice. I don't think that the field cannot continue by just borrowing from K to 12. I think there are some really worthy K to 12 information that might be useful to the adult education context. But I always think that it's important to implement it if you think it works, but then monitor it to make sure that it does, and that involves professional judgment. So the next discussion is on just my summary of everything that I've presented here. I think a 1-hour webinar is of course not sufficient to really give you to give you more than the fundamentals. I think what you can get from me today is just the fundamentals of what evidence-based instruction is, and I've provided some links at the end which will help you to venture out and conduct some of your own research on the topic. There is information out there, although a lot of it is not from the adult education context. We are preparing a research brief on evidence-based instruction that will have a different, I guess, slant in terms of the presentation of the topic. But this gives you some directions and some places that you might want to go, and some topics you might want to look at as you pursue this important topic more. In summary, it's important to bear in mind that there is a historical, legal, and practical basis for defining evidence. Evidence is not, I saw it today and it worked today and it's good. It requires monitoring over time. It requires rigor. It is important to also know and bear in mind that K to 12 information have informed practices, but there are some more definitive adult education initiatives in the last decades, and I described 4 of them to you. And of course, the current focus on key adult education subject areas are, it's math, writing, and reading, and teacher effectiveness. And perhaps with the new move in technology, there might be more of a drive in that area that might possibly be integrated with these other subject areas, but it is hard to tell at this point. The definition of evidence reflects or are constrained by particularities or uniqueness of adult education. And what I mean by that is adult education is a unique field. It doesn't have the funding, for example, that the K-12 system have. The K-12 system can do an $8 million randomized control trial that occurs over a 5-year period and come up with evidence. Adult education does not have that kind of funding. And so we are a unique field, and a unique field requires a unique way of looking at meaning that has been generated to this point. And so that's my opinion in that regard. So I think some of the prevailing works include definitions of evidence-based instruction that they're not necessarily aligned with NCLB definition of scientific research, but that we are looking at a very unique field, a field of a different learner population, a field that has different theories of about learning, about how a person learns. I mean, adult learning theory, for example. And so our definitions can relate to definitions from other education sector, but I'm contending that I think we need to begin to define our own, because what might be relevant in K-12 may not be relevant to the lives of the adults in the adult education system. So I think there has to be some way of thinking, I guess, about this whole definition of evidence. And then the aim of all the work that is being done within the, with this idea of evidence-based instruction, it's really to ensure that much more than professional judgment determine instructional and programmatic practices. And I think that had been a previous prevailing strategy in adult education. There is a focus on professional judgment. When I think in 2005 we conducted a study on student transition, and a lot of programs were focused or on professional judgment. There wasn't a lot of talk about what is informing your practice, what body of information informs what you do. And that was then, and this is now. I mean, between 2005 and now, look at the 4 big initiatives that EVE Octave has put out. So there is a lot of change, and the change is rapid, and so there is information out there. The evidence may not be what Grover Whitehurst or whoever wrote NCLB might think is evidence, but I think there are really great opportunities in adult education to monitor student change, and that's what's critical. Monitor student change and advancement. Are they transitioning from one level to the other? And what instructional practices have been consistently used to support their transition. And I think, if that's monitored systematically, I would venture to say that's a form of evidence, even though a randomized controlled trial wasn't involved. There is now a strong body of work that is informed by and that continues to shape the evidence that we have in adult education, and I think we can take advantage of that. Clearly, we are in no position to implement a large-scale randomized control trial. These, let me tell you, are very, very expensive, and it takes lots of years. So by the time they're done with it, we're looking at the next millennium. But there are really, really excellent and promising practices in adult education, which should preclude all interest on depending solely on professional judgment. So professional judgment is clearly important because the data cannot read itself. We need people to look, at what data are being generated from which practices, and make professional judgments about whether or not, for example, to continue with a particular practice or whether or not it should be ended. So the idea here is really to pair professional judgment and experience with the best or the most promising practices, and in the field of adult education, it is a lot of promising practices that we have. We have endless promising practices, and many, many program directors, in many interviews that I've conducted with different program directors across the country, there are some really, really important promising practices that I think we should call them our evidence. All right, we have come to the end of our presentation, and I wanted to know if there are any questions that I can answer at this point.
Thanks, Ernestine. We are going to open it up now for questions. But since we're almost out of time, I did want to make sure that everyone is aware that we do request that you complete an evaluation form. You'll find the link to that on the right-hand side, or bottom right-hand corner of the page. And if you would like to receive a certificate of completion for the webinar, then we do require that you submit that. Okay, so Ernestine, we did receive a few questions for you. Let me scroll. And thank you, Chris, for pointing out that the link will still automatically open when the meeting is closed. So
I saw a question about about a link. There are links right after the presentation. Let me just switch. Let me just flip the. Can you go to the next 2 pages?
Sure.
Right. These are the links here. So, should I click on them?
No, I think we're good. These are available. Everyone can see them as they're writing down their questions. I do want to note that the Adult Education Teacher Effectiveness link, if you try to click on that, will not work. The project is wrapping up now, and that link will be active beginning on August 1st. So I don't want you to get frustrated if you do try to click on that.
Okay. What are the questions?
So one of the questions was, do we need to do our own research in order to plan our lessons?
I think there are some really. I think many of the way that lessons are planned are based on best practices and how to design instruction. And I think if you'd like, I can send you some information on that. But I think this information is so widely available that I wouldn't say do your own research, but I think you can do your own review of documents to see which lesson plan might be most suitable for the kind of class that you have. I think different classes, the different constitution of the different classes might require a different type of planning. The planning of lessons is a function of it's of programming. It's a function of student type. So there are a lot of things to consider. I don't think all lessons can be randomly or willy-nilly applied to all classes. So in that regard, I think you can do some research, but I think lesson plans or lesson planning, information on the planning of lesson is so widely available that it would be beneficial to you to look and examine the literature somewhat to see what best practices are out there for the particular student type that you're working with.
Great. And another.
You may not. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say you may not find much in adult education. You might have to look into the K-12 or post-secondary education. But, I would venture to argue that there are a lot of program directors, a lot of adult educators, adult education program directors across the U.S. that have some real good documents, real good information. And many of the adult education conferences, this type of information is shared. So it is always important, I think, for teachers to be involved in research in some way, even if that research means monitoring your students closely. It doesn't have to be all aspects of the type of rigorous research that researchers do, but I think monitoring students would be one example of utilizing a research technique, and also conducting your own reading, your own review of information so that you can advance and develop professionally. So yes is the answer to that question.
Great, thanks, Ernestine. And another question asked if CASAS results can count as another form of evidence.
It's a form of their evidence. It might work. I think the best thing for teachers to do when you're looking at what is being produced and shared with you as evidence, I think it's really good to know how to review methodologies to see what is involved in the determination of the evidence. Evidence that is generated is informed by a research methodology, a particular perspective about how to assess knowledge. Within the field of quantitative research, for example, evidence means you can see it, you can touch it, you can smell it. It is a function of your senses. Within the qualitative research, the perspective is if you think it, it's real. And the idea is that there are multiple realities. So the perspective is very, very much different. So I think, teachers should look to see what kind of methodologies are used. I mean, if someone interviewed one student and, you know, came up with findings or evidence of a student change, the quantitative researchers would say this is not a representative sample of your classroom, for example. And the qualitative researchers would say, if you study that student for a whole year, what you generate there is real evidence of student change. They will depend on that data. You see, so different schools of thought have different perspectives.
Okay. Before we wrap up, I see that we're 5 minutes over. I do want to highlight what Vicki noted in the chat pod, that California was a pilot state for STAR and Teal, and so since it sounds like she's able and willing, I do want to encourage you to get in touch with Vicki. I think it would be an excellent resource for you if you have additional questions about those projects and perhaps how you can use some of those evidence-based practices in your own instruction. Thank you again, all of you, for participating and asking great questions. And I want to thank Anastine for a wonderful presentation. I hope you all learned a lot, and I hope you will join us in 2 weeks for our next webinar in our series. Thanks again, and please don't forget to complete the evaluation when you leave.